She walked into the gleaming garage like she owned not only the building but every person inside it, and in many ways, she did. Amara Langford, the daughter of the tech conglomerate's founder and now its powerful CEO, a woman known across the industry for her icy demeanor and ruthless efficiency, heels clicking sharply on the marble tiles as she strode toward the gathering of engineers crowded around the flagship prototype. Her eyes shielded behind dark Chanel sunglasses even, though they were underground, and as she approached, the murmurs stopped, engineers turning to face her. Most with embarrassment in their posture, because this wasn't supposed to happen, not with this project. Not today, not with 30 of the best minds from across the globe working day and night to make this moment perfect. And yet here they were, huddled around a silent machine, the most advanced electric vehicle ever designed, a machine that cost $20 million to develop. That had been announced in front of media and investors just 3 days ago, and now it sat dead and lifeless in the center of the bay. Its systems unresponsive, its diagnostics looping endlessly without result. And as she looked over the motionless dashboard and dim control panels, she let out a laugh that carried across the room like a blade slicing through paper. Short, sarcastic, unforgiving. So let me get this straight, she said, folding her arms as she faced them all like a teacher scolding her class. 30 engineers, 3 years of development, millions in funding, and not a single one of you can figure out why it won't turn on. Her voice cut through the silence, sharp and biting. The kind of voice that made interns quit and VPs rethink their careers. And not one of them dared respond because they all knew the truth. The car was locked out. The internal AI had gone into a failsafe loop, and the system rejected every attempt to override or reboot. Even manual access ports were disabled, and every single specialist had tried everything they knew, and nothing worked. And then, as her gaze swept the room, it landed on him, standing slightly off to the side, his arms crossed and posture calm, almost detached. Not out of arrogance but observation. And she narrowed her eyes. He didn't belong here. Not in this room full of six-figure experts flown in from Germany, Japan, California, and Seoul. And yet here he was, wearing a blue oil-stained jumpsuit with a patch that read Facility Maintenance. Icon. His hands darkened with grease, a notebook tucked under one arm. And she sneered slightly as she took a step toward him, drawing the attention of everyone else. You, she said, her voice now low but unmistakably accusatory. This area is restricted. Janitors don't belong in this bay. And the man, Elias, looked up at her without flinching, his eyes clear, unbothered. I was working on the ventilation, he said simply, and his voice wasn't defensive or nervous. It was just honest, and that irritated her more than if he'd begged or stammered. Well, she said, sarcasm thick in her tone, unless you happen to be an AI systems engineer in disguise, I suggest you get back to unclogging air filters. And she turned away with a smug glance at the others, but he didn't move, didn't leave, just walked calmly over to the vehicle's side, crouched near the rear left tire, and ran his hand along a nearly invisible seam in the carbon fiber paneling, drawing curious glances now from the engineers, a few of whom took cautious steps forward, not quite sure whether to intervene or observe. And from his jumpsuit pocket, he pulled out a small square module, no bigger than a matchbox, crudely constructed, wires sticking out from all sides, but clearly handmade with care and precision. And he slid it into a narrow auxiliary port hidden beneath the shell, a port most had dismissed as inactive during early tests. And then, from his other pocket, he drew out an old smartphone, screen cracked at the corner, battery duct taped to the back, and tapped a sequence of commands with his thumb. And then for the first time in 16 hours, the car lit up, dashboard blinking to life, soft hum rising as the energy core engaged. Internal diagnostics scrolling across the display in a blur of green text, and audible gasps echoed around. The garage, the lead engineer, blinking in disbelief. It's responding, he whispered, stepping forward. The neural core is online again. How? How did he do that? And Amara froze mid-step, spinning back around to see the impossible happening in real time. The machine that 30 of the world's smartest engineers couldn't wake up had just been brought back to life by the man she had openly mocked not 60 seconds earlier, and she stared as he stood up, brushing off his hands on a rag, the makeshift device still lodged in the port, humming gently, and one of the engineers, Yamamoto, from Osaka, rushed over, scanning the feed. He bypassed the AI freeze loop. He said breathlessly, the onboard sensor misread the driver as unconscious emergency safety locked the whole system. It thought the user was dead. And this, he pointed to the module, this acted as a manual override for the heartbeat sensor, tricking the system into a reboot cycle. And another engineer muttered, why didn't we catch that? And Ilias looked at them all, still calm, still quiet. Because you were looking at code and firmware, he said. Not the physical signal, paths. The analog heartbeat line is flawed. It spikes under stress. Tricks the system into panic mode, especially if the driver's hand is cold. And silence followed, complete silence, the kind that only comes when something undeniable has just happened, when the truth walks into the room and plants its flag. And Amara stood still, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing heavily on her shoulders, because she knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't a lucky guess. Wasn't a coincidence, this was insight. Real raw, intuitive brilliance. The kind that didn't come with degrees or awards. The kind that couldn't be taught, only earned through blood and oil and failure. And in that moment, her pride clashed violently with her reason, and she didn't speak. Not yet, just stood as the engineers now gathered around Ilias, not out of arrogance but curiosity, asking how he discovered it, how long he'd known, how he built the device. And he answered simply, humbly, no drama, no gloating, just truth, that he'd overheard their conversations. That he'd noticed the warning patterns on the test logs displayed on the external screen near the elevator. That he recognized the same failure symptoms he'd once seen years ago in a homemade electric scooter he'd built from junkyard parts in Karachi, where a faulty battery sensor nearly caused a fire. And as they listened, truly listened, it became clear this man wasn't just some lucky maintenance worker, he was a savant. Someone who saw the machine not as lines of code or networks of protocols, but as a living system of components, wires, rhythms, flows. And it was that vision so rare, so grounded, that had led him to the solution no one else could see. And as the power continued to surge through the prototype, as it sat humming softly like a lion finally stirred from sleep, Amara looked at him one more time, this time with something almost human behind her eyes. Not fear, not admiration exactly, but perhaps something closer to respect. And while she didn't speak right then, while she didn't apologize or explain or soften, the air between them shifted. The room itself changed, because everyone now knew he wasn't just a mechanic, and she wasn't just a CEO, and what came next would be nothing like what came before. That night, the air in the city felt heavier than usual as Ilias walked the narrow backstreets to his small workshop tucked behind an abandoned textile mill. The kind of place people didn't notice and rarely visited. A rusted sliding gate, barely held together by chain links and stubborn hinges, marking the entrance to a world most would never imagine existed, a world of quiet dedication, tireless tinkering, and dreams too big for the spaces they were kept in. And as he stepped inside and flipped the switch, a single flickering bulb buzzed to life, illuminating a table covered in old batteries, worn circuit boards, handwritten schematics, and tiny motors cannibalized from discarded printers and power tools. And in the corner stood the skeleton of his real obsession, a handmade EV prototype, assembled from the remains of broken cars, recycled steel frames, and parts no one else wanted. Its form still incomplete, its systems barely functional. But it was his vision, his passion, something he had poured every ounce of himself into. For 5 long years, not because anyone asked him to, not because anyone paid him, but because he believed, truly believed, that the future of innovation didn't belong only to the rich or the educated, but to those who saw problems and refused to walk away. And now, standing in the dim light of his hidden sanctuary, Illy ran his fingers over the blueprints pinned to the wall, a mess of lines and equations and ideas born from long nights without sleep and days filled with noise and sweat. And he couldn't help but replay the events of the day over and over again, the look in her eyes, the moment the dashboard lit up, the stunned silence of the engineers, the way they listened to him afterward with genuine curiosity, not mockery, not dismissal, but attention. And though he didn't need their validation, it was the first time he felt seen, not for what he wore, or where he came from, but for what he knew and what he could do. And it was strange, in a way, because for years he had walked the corridors of that company invisible. Another name on a maintenance schedule, another forgotten voice in the noise of corporate ambition, and yet one small act, one moment of truth, had cracked that illusion wide open. And now things were different, irreversibly so, because truth has a way of demanding its own place at the table once it's revealed. And as he sat at his workbench, scribbling new ideas into the margins of his notebook, he heard the soft rumble of an unfamiliar vehicle outside, and moments later, the Nakalite tapping against the iron gate, hesitant but deliberate. And when he opened it, he saw her not in heels, not in a designer coat, but in sneakers and a plain windbreaker, her hair tied back, makeup gone, a tablet in one hand, and eyes no longer sharp with judgment but calm, perhaps uncertain, but genuine. And for a long moment they just looked at each other, two people from worlds that had never meant to intersect. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I want you on my team," she said, not as a command, not as a bribe, but as a statement of fact. And when he didn't respond, she stepped forward and added, "You saw what 30 engineers, Miss Tai, don't care what school you went to, or how many titles you have or don't have. Do I need people who can see the machine, who understand it the way you do?" And he watched her for signs of insincerity but saw none. Only the weight of a decision she'd clearly wrestled with since the moment she saw the car come back to life. And though part of him wanted to say, number, to stay in his quiet world where he answered to no one and built what he believed in without politics or pressure, Another part deeper, quieter whispered that maybe this was the door he had been waiting for, the chance not just to fix things but to build something greater than he ever could alone. And after a long pause, he nodded once. And that was all it took. The next morning he walked through the same garage, but this time with a badge that read Lead Systems Advisor, and heads turned as he passed. Not out of mockery, but acknowledgement. And Amara walked beside him, introducing him not as a mechanic or technician, but as the man who saved the prototype and redefined their understanding of its neural interface. And in the weeks that followed, everything changed. The engineers who once scoffed at him now brought him ideas, questions, designs to review, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to know how he saw the world, how he thought about machines, how he noticed things they missed. And Elias never wanted to chase the spotlight, focused only on the work, pushing the prototype further, redesigning its flawed safety protocols, building new AI pathways that merged human instinct with algorithmic precision. And his workshop became an unofficial innovation lab, visited by interns, designers, even executives who came not to impress but to learn. And as the new version of the vehicle approached its first live demo, Amara stood before a packed auditorium, investors and media watching. And when asked about the car's breakthrough stability and recovery systems, she paused, then said plainly, "Those improvements weren't from me or my boardroom, they came from the mind of someone we once overlooked." And in that moment, a camera panned to Ilias, sitting quietly near the back, expression unreadable but heart-racing with the unfamiliar weight of recognition. And after the presentation, as the crowd buzzed with excitement, she found him again, this time smiling slightly, and asked, "Do you regret saying yes?" And he thought for a moment, then said, "Not because of the badge or the salary, because now I know I don't have to choose between silence and survival." And she nodded, because she understood, too, how often people were judged, not by their knowledge but by their background. How brilliance was sometimes buried beneath class and accent and perception. And in the months that followed, their unlikely partnership flourished, not without friction, not without disagreement, but with mutual respect. And slowly, the company culture began to shift. Mentorship programs launched. New eyes were given space to speak. Ideas once dismissed were explored, and though many still saw Ilias as an anomaly, others began to wonder how many more minds like his had been ignored for years. How many innovations had died quiet deaths because someone didn't wear the right shoes or speak with the right words. And while Amara still remained the powerful figurehead of the company, she now built with her eyes wider, her ears sharper. And when the next vehicle was unveiled, a fully autonomous model with hybrid learning capabilities, it bore a small inscription on its chassis near the core system's port. One that read IK7, a quiet tribute to the mechanic who once fixed what 30 engineers couldn't. And when a journalist later asked what the letter stood for, she smiled and replied, "The man who reminded us that real genius doesn't always come from a labit, sometimes wears grease under its nails." And far from the cameras, in his workshop, Ilias continued to build not for fame, not for validation, but because he still believed in the machine, in what it could become, in the quiet rhythm of progress, made not by noise but by persistence. And sometimes, when the nights stretched long and the lights of the city glowed in the distance, he would think back to that day in the garage, the moment everything changed, not because he demanded it, but because he dared to show up and trust what he knew, even when no one else did. And that, in the end, made all the difference.